Okay, so sex therapists would recommend that you begin sex education as early as possible. So maybe by early adolescence, people begin to learn as much as they can about their bodies, about sexual interaction in terms of what is healthy, what is not healthy, and destigmatize sex. Avoid goal or performance oriented approaches to sex therapy, and communicate openly with your partner. Okay, so now we get into problems that are sort of consequences of expressing sexuality through sexual behavior. So we've all heard about sexually transmitted infections, and they are simply diseases that are transmitted through sexual acts. So they're usually transmitted through vaginal secretions, through semen. They can be transmitted through blood, through mucous membranes, through saliva. And so those are things that are exchanged during sex. Even blood in terms of tears in the vaginal wall. So it kind of provides access to your bloodstream. And so sex is something that can transmit specific types of infections like chlamydia, genital warts, gonorrhea, HIV, genital herpes, hepatitis, syphilis, among a long list of other infections. Sexually transmitted infections are common. They are very, very, very common. And most are treatable, some are not. And some that are treatable may not be curable. So something like chlamydia may be curable, something like syphilis may be curable, something like hepatitis B may be treatable, and curing is fairly difficult. The same thing with genital herpes and genital warts, which are also related to herpes. The other piece with sexually transmitted infections is even those that are curable or treatable can cause damage when you have it. So something like chlamydia can cause damage to the sex organs, which can make it difficult for women to have children. And so there are consequences beyond just embarrassment or itchiness or discharge that go along with sexually, or even stigma that go along with sexually transmitted infections. There can be long-standing consequences, and we all are familiar with HIV and its progression to AIDS, and the consequences related to that. But I think the reality is something like HIV, though it is considered to be an epidemic, it is nowhere near as prevalent as these other sexually transmitted infections. And so to overlook those would be doing a real disservice to people, because these are the ones that are out there and that are circulating in the population pretty frequently. Sexually transmitted infections have a lot of symptoms that are familiar, and some of them are asymptomatic, which can be difficult, which is why they say get tested, get a comprehensive test for a variety of sexually transmitted infections, get it regularly, get a pap smear, because that can also be an indicator of having contracted a sexually transmitted infections. But some of the symptoms, for men, it's usually related to discharge from the penis, soreness inside the penis, pain when urinating. For women, also related to unusual discharge, something that doesn't smell right or doesn't look right, out of cycle abdominal pain or unusual bleeding. And then for both men and women, you might get pain or painful intercourse, pain during urination, diarrhea, sores or blisters around the genital area, a rash on your hands or feet, or even the entire body. So now we're talking about just immune responses, right? Small cauliflower-shaped growths around the sex organs, itching, flu-like feelings, or swollen glands. And unfortunately, the symptoms can be for a lot of different diseases. So you might have a flu-like feeling after contracting HIV. So we don't even call AIDS what you contract. You don't really contract AIDS. That's what HIV turns into. But contracting it, what people often feel at first is just a little sick. So they don't get pain during intercourse and painful urination. They don't get symptoms around the sex organs. They just generally feel sick, and then that goes away. Because anything that you're contracting is an infection, it causes an immune response. And so any of those things can be a signal that something is wrong. Okay. We won't talk as much about AIDS and HIV. We'll just say that in terms of black women, Black women contract HIV at rates higher than other women in this country. In terms of numbers, there are about 9,000 new cases per year. And so the numbers relative to the 200 million African Americans in this country are relatively low. However, people are relatively healthy. And so to have 9,000 people a year contracting a disease is actually something significant. The majority of women are contracting HIV from men, from male partners, and male to female transmission is very, what's the word I'm looking for? It is very easy for women to contract the disease from men because it's in semen and they're receiving the semen and they're likely to have tears in the vagina or it can go through the mucous membranes. And so it's much harder to transmit HIV from women to men because there's just not as much of an exchange of fluid, and men don't have vulnerable parts of their body as exposed. So the penis is covered with skin, which is actually very protective. The vagina is not covered with skin. It's actually covered with a mucal membrane, which is not protective. And if you ever take risky behaviors, what you might learn is one of the reasons HIV is so tricky is it goes into your body right at a point that will take it directly to your immune system, and it attacks your immune system. So your mucal membranes have a nice defense against anything getting in because it catches whatever foreign bodies come in there and they take it straight to your immune system. Well, HIV is a foreign body and it goes straight to your immune system, and that's why contracting it can be so dangerous, and that's why women are particularly vulnerable. The majority of women who are contracting HIV, like I said, contracting it from men. The second highest rates are from intravenous drug use. And those are the most common ways for African Americans to contract HIV. And so that's why we say get tested. That's why I say use protection and know your partner. And be mindful of sexual networks. And that's the idea that if you have 10 people and they are coupled up and those 10 people break up and get with each other, the same 10 people, you have a higher likelihood of an infection being transmitted amongst those people. So those people who share a sexual network have a higher risk of contracting an infection than 10 other people who don't share the same sexual network. Now, why do I tell you that? College. College is a pretty closed environment where you have a finite number of people who tend to interact with the same people. So people in college tend not to form relationships with people outside of college. They tend to form relationships with people inside the college. And so you have a fairly closed sexual network. So if there's any infection or any disease within that network, everybody else in that network has an increased risk of contracting that disease because it is a closed sexual network. There were several studies that were done on some North Carolina college campuses where some men who reported sleeping with men contracted HIV, and there was an outbreak in that community because it was a closed sexual network. So that's something that we like to say be careful of in the college years, because you are working in a small environment, and if you are engaging in sex with people in that environment, you might be at a higher risk than it seems. Okay, so ways to stay safe and to not be at risk and to not contract an infection. The number one way is to remain abstinent. Right? So if you are not engaging in sex, then you are not at risk. And that's not to say engaging in a type of sex, but if you are not engaging in sexual behaviors, then you're not at risk. If you are engaging in sexual behaviors and you have one partner and you are mutually faithful, both people are mutually faithful, both people are uninfected, then you are safe. So in theory, if you have two individuals let's say you have two individuals who've never had sexual partners, they are each other's first sexual partners, they are each other's only sexual partners, they are not at risk of transmitting infections.